metabolic flexibility is a term that is becoming
Yeah.
increasingly popular. And I think it's been misused in lots of ways as well, because there is this idea that if you just shift your diet to having a bit more fat, it gives a little bit more metabolic flexibility. Why don't we define exactly what metabolic flexibility is taken to mean?
Okay. Yeah. I think this would lead us down a really interesting, maybe more in-depth path that we need to explore.
Sure, yeah.
To fully appreciate it. But let's just tackle the term metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility is a term that came about to try and illustrate, in essence, the flexibility or the switching between burning carbohydrate versus burning fat.
Okay. So
there's periods of time where you're going to be burning carbohydrate, and then there's periods of times when you need to be burning fat.
Okay.
And to illustrate metabolic flexibility, we can look at certain scenarios where you would expect there to be metabolic flex or a switch of fuels. So one would be that difference between a fed and a fasted state.
Uh-huh.
So a fasted state, let's say you haven't had anything to eat for 12 hours, you're in a truly fasted state. So you haven't had any new fuel coming into the system. So you are, yes, you might have been releasing your carbohydrate stores, but you have certainly in earnest started to liberate your fat stores, release those fatty acids, and you're using fatty acids where you can for energy. You're not using 100% fat, but you've shifted towards more fat oxidation, more fat burning.
Okay.
Because you haven't had any carbohydrate.
No carbs coming in, yeah.
So that's like a situation of predominantly fat burning. And then you have a meal, and let's say that meal contains carbohydrate. And of course, you've got new carbohydrate coming to the system. Mm-hmm. Your whole metabolic apparatus, mainly orchestrated through the liver, mm-hmm. is now going to shift you towards utilizing that carbohydrate. So replenishing stores of carbohydrate in your liver, taking up and using carbohydrate in your muscle to store, to use. And the fact you've got carbohydrate means that no longer are you releasing fat from your adipose tissue, you're now storing fat in your adipose tissue. So you've gone from burning fat in a fasted state to now burning, utilizing carbohydrate in a fed state.
And why does, in the presence of both fat and carbohydrates, why does my body prefer using carbs when actually I want it to be using fat as much as possible, particularly if I want to lose a bit of fat mass?
That's an interesting question. I've never had anyone ask it in that exact way before. Does it prefer to use carbohydrates? That sort of almost implies it's got a conscience.
Yeah.
It's making a choice to choose to burn carbohydrates.
I mean, everyone likes carbs.
I suppose it go back to the metabolic perspective of it. If you were to do any biochemistry, is to recognize that the whole of your metabolic apparatus is orchestrated around carbohydrate availability.
Uh-huh.
Right. So everything is dictated by glucose availability, effectively.
Yeah.
So when you've got glucose, you use glucose. And when you don't use glucose, you spare glucose. So from a metabolic perspective, it's not to say your body's got a preference for it,
mm-hmm.
but because carbohydrate is a preferred fuel, everything is going to be orchestrated around its availability. And part of that is because certain things have to be fueled by carbohydrate. For example, the brain. So we have to supply carbohydrate, and we have to have a constant supply line of carbohydrate. And we can't maintain that supply line indefinitely without a new supply of carbohydrate coming into the system. So when we have carbohydrate coming into the system, we need to be able to really utilize that as efficiently as possible.
Okay.
So that's why everything is going to be switched on around carbohydrate availability.
Okay.
And that's mainly driven by insulin, because insulin it's not because you're going to have fluctuations in glucose in the blood, but any change in circumstance is reflected in insulin. Because when you've got new carbohydrate coming to the system, that triggers insulin release from your pancreas. And it's that insulin which does all the coordination that stops you manufacturing glucose from the liver, and stops you exporting glucose out of the liver, and enables you to store some carbohydrate in the liver instead. It enables your muscle to take up and utilize that carbohydrate, whether it's storing or utilizing it for energy. Enables your adipose tissue to take it up, because you need that carbohydrate to store fatty acids. It's not just fat that ends up as fat. And you might even use some of that carbohydrate to manufacture other things. Maybe some amino acids, maybe some fatty acids, because you can afford to do it because you've got a new supply. Now, when that supply dwindles and you haven't got a new supply coming in, you start to not immediately switch.
Sure.
It's not just like a on-off thing, but over time, things will start to gradually shift towards, over those several hours, away from carbohydrate utilization towards fat utilization.
Okay.
So in answer to go back to your original question, not to say you've got a preference for it, but the system is designed in a way where carbohydrate is your preferred fuel, and fat is your backup fuel.
Gotcha.
So rather than have just one fuel that you use all the time, you've got a preferred fuel and a backup fuel.
Gotcha.
So that means that you can adjust to different situations more effectively. Like I said, flex.
So you're like a hybrid car. If you've got enough electricity, great. But if you don't have, then you're going to use the petrol in the back. Okay. And you've got plenty of petrol, especially if you're only doing like short runs around the city or whatever. Okay. So you've got this scenario where in a fasted state, you've got the ability to dip into fat, and that's what your preferred source would be. And then you've got this state where you've actually got some food, carbohydrate / or broken down into glucose. And then your cells will switch to that in the presence of insulin that does all these jobs, tells the liver to stop producing sugar and pump it out into the bloodstream, gets your muscles to take up the carbs, and your fat cells to take in fat as well. Have I got that right?
Yeah. Well, yes. So you're doing two things in adipose tissue. You're taking up fatty acids and you're taking up glucose.
Yes.
To join with those fatty acids to form that triglyceride. Triacylglycerol, yes.
Yeah, the fat.
To store fat.
Store fat, exactly. Okay. So metabolic flexibility.
Yes.
What is the metabolic
So the metabolic flexibility concept is the idea that you need to be in a situation where sometimes you're burning carbohydrate and sometimes you're burning fat. So the illustration of it is when you've got, how easy is it for you to transition from the fed to the fasted state? How easy is it for you to transition from a resting state to a exercise state? So you could illustrate it by how easy is it for you to switch from carbohydrate to fat if you go from feeding to fasted or overnight. So if you measure someone overnight, how big a switch is it, or how long does it take for them, or how much do they switch from carbohydrate to fat?
Okay. So if I was to take an example, right, and I this will be an extreme example. Let's say I stop eating at 8 p.m. I've just had a pizza, let's say. I do sometimes eat pizza. I fasted for 12 hours. And in the morning, I've started already burning fat. And when I break my fast, I'll start using carbohydrates or whatever I'm consuming, whether that's protein and fats, etc. If I'm efficient, I'm metabolically flexible, that should happen. Let's say I'm metabolically inflexible and I extend that fasting window. So I didn't break my fast until 12 p.m. the following day. So I've been fasting for a longer period of time and I still don't start burning fat. is that a strong indicator that I am metabolically inflexible, i.e., I'm not switching to another fuel source utilization to power my metabolism?
Yeah. Well, you're pretty much there. Yeah. So if you were going to test someone's metabolic flexibility, you would probably do that. You would feed them, you would measure them overnight, let's say. So you might put them in a metabolic chamber, or you might measure them, say, after a meal at dinner, and then measure them again in the morning after however many hours of fasting.
Gotcha.
To see how they've switched from carbohydrate to fat. And if they're metabolically inflexible, then the extent by which they make that switch would be less pronounced than someone who's metabolically flexible.
Gotcha.
But it's not just about transitioning from carbohydrate to fat.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the other way, which is, again, what people don't appreciate.
Yeah.
You always think about it's all about fat burning, but it's about your ability to deal with the carbohydrate as well.
Yeah.
So if you feed them the carbohydrate, if that person's metabolically flexible, they'll be able to take that carbohydrate, clear it from the blood, utilize it very effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll be able to switch to carbohydrate utilization much more effectively.
Mm.
And of course, that's coming into play in terms of things like glucose intolerance,
Mm-hmm.
pre-diabetes, which effectively is another manifestation of metabolic inflexibility,
Mm-hmm.
because you're not able to switch, you're not able to use that carbohydrate. Now, that also means that when you measure them several hours after a meal, they're not going to be switching to burning fat as effectively, because they're still trying to manage the carbohydrate that you fed them in the meal that you gave them before.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about your ability to switch to burning fat or how good you are at burning fat. It's how good you are at dealing with the carbohydrate as well.
Yeah.
Which is important.
So if I'm metabolically inflexible, I want to talk a bit about how we become more flexible. But if I'm metabolically inflexible, what kind of conditions, you mentioned a couple already, does that predispose me to?
So that would be the conditions that we all suffer from pretty much in the Western civilization, which is cardiovascular disease and insulin resistance diabetes.
Mm.
So insulin resistance diabetes is probably a more obvious one that people can understand, if you think of metabolic flexibility, because like I said, if you've got an impaired ability to clear and utilize that carbohydrate, that's an example of metabolic inflexibility. But cardiovascular disease is also part of metabolic inflexibility, because if you're not switching from carbohydrate to fat, then it's not because you're not able to burn your own stores of fat, but you're also impairing your ability to manage the flow of lipid or fat around the blood.
Mm.
And that's not just the fats coming that you're liberating from your fat stores. It's fat that you've fed in whatever it is you're eating, because people don't just eat pure carbohydrate.
Sure.
They're eating a mixed meal with got protein and fat and carbohydrate in it. So your ability to deal with that ingested new lipid coming into the system, but also the management of the lipid that you've already got in the system, the fat that's circulating around the blood, your lipoproteins, these shopping bags full of fat that are floating around your blood, which links to what people measure as your cholesterol.
Yeah.
Where's your cholesterol? It's in these lipoproteins, these shopping bags floating around the blood. And the reason why it becomes an issue is because you're not able to clear those shopping bags anymore. They're just carrying on being kicked back out into the circulation all the time. And then they start to interact with each other and they become more atherogenic.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is they're more likely to get where they shouldn't be, which is underneath the endothelium of your arteries, and then they start triggering an inflammatory response, and that whole process of cardiovascular disease begins.
Yeah.
But the origins of all of that is an inability to regulate or manage all of that fat that's circulating around the blood.
Yeah. So it's a combination of the lack of flexibility of different fuel sources, but
Yeah.
also the efficiency of the fuel sources themselves as well. Like how we actually utilize carbohydrates and those fats.
Yeah.
So how does one become more metabolically flexible? What are the key things that we should all be doing to increase our ability to be more efficient and to switch?
Okay. I'm going to address that in reverse.
Okay, go for it.
So let's describe a situation where it's wrong.
Okay.
And how that could be reversed or tackled to make it better.
Perfect.
So let's describe a reason why people might have metabolic inflexibility. So one thing, which I know we haven't really tackled this at all, which I'm actually quite pleased about, because a lot of people focus on this more than they should. And that's, say, obesity. Right? So obesity or having excess weight, we know is associated with metabolic inflexibility, for example. And of course, it's also a strong risk factor for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all the things that people are getting ill from. It's not because they're carrying around too much weight, it's because they've got a risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and the end products of all of that in terms of disease. But why does that happen? Why are those things so intrinsically linked? And the way to understand metabolic inflexibility is to describe a system that can't cope. Right? So let's take one thing related to obesity. So why is it that having excess weight or too much body fat leads to cardiovascular disease and diabetes? And the reason for that is that it's an inability to store fat. So, which sounds like paradoxical.
Yeah.
Got so much fat, but yet I've got an impaired ability to store fat. If you think of it like let's say our ability to store fat, if you think of it like a cup, that cup's got a certain capacity to it.
Yeah.
So if I pour whatever it is into that cup, it'll be fine until it gets to the brim of that cup. And then that's it. I can't take it anymore. And if I carry on pouring it, all of that fat's then all of that content's going to spill out.
Spill outside.
So it's going to overflow.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially what's happening in your adipose tissue. So it's not the fact that you have too much fat per se. It's the fact that your fat cells are not able to serve you well in terms of storing that fat. So it's the fact that your fat cells are too large and full up. And so, of course, they become resistant to fat storage. So it's like a balloon. You can blow it up so much, but then it becomes harder and harder to blow it up because you've reached capacity of that balloon. It's essentially what happens with your adipose tissue. So if you're constantly storing more fat than you can cope with, then yes, you're going to be producing more fat cells to store that fat in, but your existing fat cells will become larger. And that's what you see with people that have obesity coupled to metabolic diseases, that have large, what we call hypertrophic or engorged adipocytes.
So is this what happens if you were to do a biopsy of a metabolically unhealthy obese person and look at that under a microscope? That's what you would see.
Yeah. But it's slightly more nuanced than that, because we can predict where those types of fat cells are going to be. And that tend to be the ones that are central. So if I look at the fat cells around my central region, they tend to be more hypertrophic. They're larger, more insulin resistant, because it's insulin that's driving the fat to be able to store. And if they're full up, then they're not going to respond to insulin as much, so they become insulin resistant. Now that can contribute to insulin resistance because those fat cells are not just clearing fat from the blood, they're also clearing glucose from the blood, because your adipocytes are also a site where glucose gets taken up to store that fat. So now you've got these fat cells that are no longer serving you in terms of storing fat. So where's that fat going to go? It's going to have to go somewhere else. It's now in circulation, is not going to be cleared. So it's not, and so that's the fat from your meal.
Yeah.
But it's also fat that perhaps was from meals long past. That are still in the circulation, that have maybe gone to the liver, been repackaged and kicked back out again. But if you're never able to store it, it's just going to end up in that circulation. Anyway, so you've now got these large hypertrophic adipocytes or fat cells, and that fat is now spilling over into other places. Now, if we said that that's a characteristic of central fat, this is why perhaps location is key. Because if you had fat around your hips and buttocks and thighs, so if you're a typical female, that gynoid shape, that pear-shaped fat distribution, those fat cells tend to be better at storing fat. So that serves you well as a metabolic sink. You can sink away and store fat. So even though you've got higher body fat, and women have 10 percentage points higher body fat in terms of percentage of weight than men, but actually that's protective. That's actually preventing them from having any issues because they've got a better capacity to store fat. But if you're a man, then you tend to store that fat more centrally, and that becomes more of an issue. But equally, a female might have that issue too. Yeah. And that's coming back to one of the questions you asked earlier about menopause, is that change in estrogen, testosterone does influence fat distribution. So then it's not that all of a sudden all your fat moves from the glutofemoral region to the central region, but any new storage of fat is more likely going to be in male pattern rather than female pattern. But if I look at that, then that in itself is not so much of an issue. So if I've got lots of central fat, but it's still just about coping, I've still not got much overspill from my cup. It's right up to the brim, but it's not overflowing yet. That's not too much of a problem. Let's say it starts to overflow. Then the first thing I need to do is store it somewhere else. And the first place I can store it is maybe my visceral fat. So I might store it in the fat cells around my viscerals rather than the fat underneath my skin, which is where I would predominantly store my fat. I'm now going to have to store it temporarily in my visceral fat. So that's why visceral fat or intra-abdominal fat is a risk factor, because that's a symbol of the fact you've got overflow. Yeah. It's now going into your visceral fat. Now that's potentially a problem. Yeah. But that's still benign because it's still captured, held there temporarily, but it's not causing an issue. Or it might end up in your liver and you might get liver fat. Yeah. And that's something that you see in people that tend to have high central adiposity. They might have high visceral fat. They might have liver fat. But liver fat technically is reversible too, because we know that the liver is very good at being able to manage loads of things. So given the opportunity, it could deal with that. So maybe temporarily it can keep that fat there. And then when times are conducive to it, it can do something with it. It can package it up, turn it into something else, chuck it back out into circulation. So far that's not creating too much of an issue, but the issue really starts to happen when that fat ends up in other places where it shouldn't be. And one of those places is the muscle. So if you start to get fat inside your muscle and you're not using that fat in that muscle, it's just ending up in that muscle because it's got nowhere else to go, then the presence of that fat in the muscle then starts to antagonize your insulin receptor. So now your muscles become less insulin sensitive. Now remember, your muscle is your main metabolic consumer. Now you've compromised that muscle's ability to take up and utilize or consume that fuel, particularly glucose. So, and the muscle is the main glucose consumer, really.
Yeah.
All right, your brain is. But in terms of the variability, it's the thing that is going to be able to increase or decrease glucose consumption. It's your muscle. Now you've compromised it by having fat in that muscle. As well as obviously your insulin resistance in your adipocytes already.
Yeah.
So now you've got peripheral or whole body insulin resistance. It's not to say that the fat in your liver is not having an issue, because temporarily that causes issues in terms of insulin resistance in your liver. Now, what insulin is doing in your liver is regulating the export of glucose out of the liver. And someone who's got an impaired glucose tolerance, the reason why they've got high hyperglycemia is not because they're consuming loads of carbohydrate and they're not clearing it from the system. They've also got an inability to stop producing more glucose out of the liver.
Yeah.
They've got an over export, or they're increasingly exporting glucose out into the system,
which is inappropriate.
Which is inappropriate.
So just to summarize where we're at the moment. So obesity with some of these large fat cells isn't necessarily an issue.
Yeah.
Even visceral fat to an extent is not necessarily an issue.
Yeah.
The fat of the overspill from those cells going to the liver and being stored in the liver, creating liver fat, formerly known as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, now known as metabolically associated or metabolic associated steatohepatitis.
Yes, yeah.
That's
which is
relatively
a much nicer term.
Which is a much nicer term. It's still reversible to an extent.
Yeah.
We can redo that, but when you start getting that fat spilling into the muscle because of muscle's role in insulin and your overall metabolism as a sink for sugar, this is where it has the real knock-on effect on cardiovascular disease, likelihood of type 2 diabetes, etc. Have I summarized that?
But there's more.
There's more.
There's more. So let's say your muscle. So we said about your muscle that is now got a compromised insulin receptor. So it becomes sort of insulin resistant. Because you've got the fat there. But that fat in your muscle is also going to overwhelm your mitochondria, the energy producing part of your muscle. And if your mitochondria become overwhelmed, then that disrupts your whole ability to dissipate energy. Altogether. So it could compromise your ability to utilize any fat that's coming into the system, into the muscle, because you obviously want your muscle to be able to take up and utilize fat for energy. If it's suddenly overwhelmed with loads of fat, and we know that actually creates some form of metabolic dysfunction. Your mitochondria can't cope with it, and so you've interfered with the metabolic machinery now of your muscle, not just the ability for that muscle to take up glucose into the muscle, but its ability to actually use that glucose in the muscle, even if it was in there, as well as any fatty acids in there.
So it's a real vicious circle you created here.
Yeah. Now, if we think of that role of fat and how it disrupts mitochondria, then that is another reason why, if it gets in other places, it causes issue. Because if that fat then starts accumulating in your pancreas, then that can impair your pancreas's ability to release insulin. Because the way in which your pancreas releases insulin is it basically takes up glucose without insulin. It takes up glucose and metabolizes it in mitochondria, which then triggers insulin release. Now, if you've got now fat in your pancreas that's now disrupting and interfering with your mitochondria, you've disrupted that whole process of releasing insulin in response to glucose. So then that's where you start to get all these issues of pre-diabetes. And then insulin resistance leading on to diabetes. And then eventually your pancreas could totally pack up.
Completely packs up. Yeah. And that's when
you won't
start
be able to produce any insulin. So these are all sort of sequential things that happen.
Yeah.
Which are almost things that happen one after the other.
Mm-hmm.
But the end product of it ends up as a risk of insulin resistance, diabetes, and of course cardiovascular disease, because you're not able to clear those lipids from the blood.
Yeah.
And your liver is just taking these lipids and repackaging them and chucking back out again.
Yeah.
And in fact, you've got all these shopping bags full of lipid and cholesterol.
Yeah.
And they start interacting with each other and becoming smaller and denser, and then they're acting like bullets, getting through endothelia.
Yeah.
You might also get
endothelia being the lining of cells, the lining around of the arteries.
The artery. You also might, if you've got a perfect storm of say something that is also damaging the endothelia itself.
Yeah.
And you've got things like high blood pressure. That's a big cardiovascular risk.
Yeah. You
got more likelihood of that atherosclerosis. So all these things are linked together.
Yeah.
So I haven't asked you a question yet.
Yeah. So
how do we get metabolically flexible?
But this is all good context.
To understand the consequences of metabolic inflexibility.
Yeah.
Because that's basically, if you follow it all the way down, those sequence of events, then that's where it starts to lead to disease.
Yeah.
The good news is that, of course, it's a sequence of events that I can reverse.
Yeah.
So I can go back in the reverse order of that sequence. And if I was saying, let's say I was looking at someone who has overweight or obesity, then we know that just losing 5% body weight has huge benefits in terms of glycemic control, cardiovascular risk, all these things dissipate, not because I've hit a certain weight or I've got a certain adiposity, but because I've scaled back that energy deficit that I'm creating. I've given you a bit of breathing space to now roll back those sequence of events. So I've mitigated some of that risk. The interesting thing about that is, and the reason why I've spent a long time describing that situation, is that although I've illustrated it with the scenario of obesity, that situation can happen without obesity, because that can be a consequence of diet and lifestyle generally.
Yeah. That
you can get a situation where, not necessarily because you've got excess body weight overall, but you are leading to this metabolic stress. These sequence of events are happening. Now, could be due to stress, for example, because remember, you've liberated all this fuel and it's got nowhere to go, and then it ends up where it shouldn't do. But if that's coupled to the fact you've got poor diet and lifestyle on top of that, but you're fueling inappropriately, feeding the wrong things at the wrong time.
Yep.
So you might be doing shift work and you're feeding things at the wrong time of day, or you're constantly oversupplying things from the dietary perspective, and you're relatively sedentary, or you've got poor physical activity behavior, then that's another perfect storm. It also explains how things like interventions of diet and lifestyle will have an impact too.
Yeah.
Irrespective of getting that person to be in an energy deficit.
Sure.
That if you did an exercise intervention or just modified the composition, timing of what they're eating around physical and obviously physical activity, exercise at the same time, you can solve the same issue.
Okay, so looking at all those different stages that lead to the end point of metabolic inflexibility, exercise that you just mentioned, I'm assuming a mixture of aerobic and strength training to improve the efficiency of the muscle, as well as put one slightly in an energy deficit. I know it's not the main way of putting people into energy deficits. It's mainly diet based, but would that be one sort of core pillar of metabolic flexibility?
Yeah. So what you could think about is, if we think of the muscle, let's focus on that, and let's think of exercise. So what's exercise going to do to the muscle? So if I was doing cardio exercise or low intensity, long duration exercise, obviously from a energy expenditure point of view, I can expend a lot of energy because I can do that, can maintain that over a long period of time. But it's not really about the energy so much. It's the fact that I'm able to utilize fuel over a long period of time. And I'm using my oxidative system. So I'm able to burn things efficiently down to carbon dioxide and water. So I'm able to burn carbohydrate, and I'm also able to burn fat during that exercise. But whatever form of exercise that I'm doing, and maybe let's take endurance exercise as an example, you are creating a crisis in that muscle because, of course, you're demanding energy, and that energy's got to be supplied.
Yeah.
And you're going to be depleting energy stores in the muscle. And the energy status of that muscle is going to be different to when it was at rest. And that trigger or that change in energy state, or that energy crisis or fuel crisis, let's say, is what triggers adaptation in that muscle.
Okay.
So if you are going to do that exercise again, or have that same stress again, your muscle would have adapted to cope with that stress better.
Okay.
That's the idea.
Okay.
And I suppose that's the idea of metabolic flexibility, or what I would say is better to think about is metabolic resilience. Because what you want is your body not to be in a constant state of homeostasis all the time, but obviously it's going to be periods where it's in excess and periods where it's in deficit. But what you want to be is in a situation of resilience, so you can cope with the excesses and the deficiencies that you've got. You can roll with the normal punches of life, because we don't live in a vacuum, and we don't eat the same thing prescriptively all the time or exercise in the same way. So we've constantly got the stresses and strains of living.
Yeah.
So that's what we need to be able to be better to cope with. And that's the idea of metabolic resilience. But how can you achieve that? One way is through creating a stress, which triggers a response, which improves your ability to deal with that stress next time. And exercise is a clear example of that.
Yeah.
It's that whole Nietzsche thing, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah. So you're increasing resilience and the adaptability of that muscle.
So that might be that you've improved your ability to take up glucose.
Yeah.
You might improve your ability to oxidize fuel because you create more mitochondria, or you improve your existing mitochondrial ability. And that might require protein, for example, because you need protein to make these things or repair and build these tissues. Or you might create the blood supply to that muscle. So all these adaptations are important and improve your ability to deal with that crisis next time. Effectively, increase your ability to burn fat.
Yeah.
So you've got a better fat burning ability of your muscle. That's really what cardio or endurance type exercise is predominantly designed to do, because that's your adaptive response to that type of exercise, so that you can carry on that for longer, or you can exercise at a higher intensity for the same duration, because you've got a better ability to oxidize fat.
Yeah.
Now, that's an important thing from a metabolic flexibility point of view. There's no point you having the ability to release fat from your stores if you've got no ability to actually oxidize that fat in your muscle. But obviously, you need to have the demand to oxidize that fat in your muscle, but you also have to have the machinery to be able to oxidize that fat in the muscle. And that's really what physical activity or exercise is helping you do.
What about fasting as a method to increase flexibility?
So that is one way in which you can.
Well, I know that's quite a vague term I've just used here. So maybe we can define it into intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding.
Yeah.
So 16 hours of fasting versus 8 hours of feeding window, or fasting as a mechanism of calorie restriction over a week, but as a way of sort of accelerating that ability of the muscle to respond to the stressor and become more adaptable.
Yeah. If we think of intermittent fasting, the interesting thing of intermittent fasting is exactly, and this is why you did that segue into it from what I was talking about is the metabolic effect of that fasting.
Mm-hmm.
Now that is muddied because, of course, when you do intermittent fasting, invariably you create weight loss.
Yeah.
So particularly if you're doing intermittent energy restriction, where you're doing something like the 5-2 or the 4-3 alternate day fasting, because invariably you're going to end up eating less. It's going to create on average across the week, maybe a 500 or 600 calorie a day deficit. So the argument then was, well, what's doing the benefit? Is it the weight loss, all the things that we talked about in terms of scaling back?
Yeah.
Or is it something to do with the fact that you've extended the fast or given them a period of fasting more so than before? I would say, yes, the weight loss is going to have a big effect, but there is definitely metabolic changes that you would see on a fast day versus a feeding day.
Okay.
Because you would see that person has shifted to oxidizing fat on a fast day versus oxidizing carbohydrate predominantly on a feeding day.
Mm-hmm.
And you will see changes in insulin release. So you're going to release more insulin on a feeding day than they would on a fasting day.
Mm.
And if you looked at it from a whole body perspective, then that would translate into you taking up and storing carbohydrate and utilizing carbohydrate on a feeding day generally, versus you liberating and utilizing fat on a fast day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does that then entrain better metabolic flexibility? I would say it probably does.
Okay.
It's just difficult to show it because you've got that confounder of weight loss.
Yeah. Mm.
And that's the same for time restricted eating.
Mm.
Because you would guess that time restricted eating wouldn't have that confounder as much, because prescriptively you're not getting people to eat any less.
Sure. Yeah.
It's just you're reducing the eating window, extending the fast.
Yeah.
But we know that people end up eating less. But we just did a study which finished a couple of weeks ago, and we just wanted to see what people's change in eating behavior was on a time restricted eating, and they end up eating 500 calories a day less because they end up skipping meals or skipping snacks, whether that's consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah.
There's less opportunity to eat. So they end up eating less.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's difficult to untangle that thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's why practically I'm a fan of time restricted feeding, because the outcome is usually that, you tend to eat less out of boredom. You tend to not snack after 8 p.m. You tend to, be a little bit more aware of your eating habits and when your meals are and when you shouldn't be eating. So I think the knock-on effect is generally a reduction in energy, which, as you said, will make you a little bit more metabolically flexible.
And they ended up eating healthier.
Actually. Yeah.
That's the other thing that happened in the study we just finished. Because like any diet, I suppose, as soon as you get someone to follow a rule, and that's what you're doing with time restricted eating, people become more mindful of what they're eating. Yeah. And that, in a way, ends up them eating better or improving their intake.
Are there easy ways in which I can tell that I'm in fat burning mode, like any consumer available tools or things that I can look at?
I know there's the Lumen tool that's obviously got
the
a lot
breath
of
one.
traction. Has obviously been highly advertised on social media.
Yeah.
And we have had contact with the company, and we've had ideas of sort of testing that product against our conventional ways in which we measure it, because it's based on the same principles that we do from a research point of view in terms of measuring substrate utilization. Well, are you burning carbohydrate? Are you burning fat? I don't know. I haven't done enough validation studies of my own to say how good it is as a tool to measure it specifically, but it is quite a good behavior reinforcer, because of course it's a way of testing yourself to see whether you are following what you want to follow.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So,
and what's the research tool that you use? Is it a ketone breath test?
So we use indirect calorimetry, it's called. So we essentially measure oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide production. So you measure either with a face mask, and you measure how much people are breathing and what the composition of their breath is to get those two things, or you put people in metabolic chambers, or we tend to use, because we're interested, well, the research I tend to do is where we want to assess a metabolic impact by looking at something dynamically. So we tend to use meal challenge as our way of testing the impact of what we're doing. So we take someone in a fasted state, we measure their metabolic rate, what they're burning in a fasted state. Then we feed them usually a mixed meal, which has got both carbohydrate and fat and a bit of protein in it. And then we measure how they respond to that meal. In terms of the energy, the consumption, yes, but the shift in substrate utilization, how they shift from a mixture of carbohydrate and fat to predominantly carbohydrate, then back to fat again over the 6 hours that you follow them after that meal.
Okay.
As well as obviously measuring the appearance of the carbohydrate and the fat in the blood and how easy it is to clear that fat and carbohydrate you fed them. So all of that metabolic handling really of that meal is a test.
Okay.
And that's why I've probably got confidence that things like intermittent fasting do have an impact on that metabolic handling, because you are allowing them to have those situations of having feeding and fasting. So you do get that acute effect, because of course, if you fast someone, they have to start burning fat because you haven't got any carbohydrate. Now that does temporarily make them intolerant to carbohydrate. So if you just suddenly dump loads of carbohydrate in them, you do get a slight intolerance to it, but that's because you're still dealing with the fat. Now, if you did that on a repeated basis, then you would probably start to get a bit of a trade-off of the two. That's the whole idea of doing intermittent fasting. But you've still got the confounder of weight, though, because of course, doing that as an intervention invariably changes how many calories people eat overall. And that leads on to obviously the most recent study that we published, which is, can we get that same metabolic effect independently of weight loss?
Okay.
Now we've sort of done that already, shown that already, because we've done interventions where we had people on a continuous energy restriction versus an intermittent energy restriction. And we followed them until they both lost the same amount of weight. And then we measured their metabolic handling. And you saw better metabolic handling, or an improvement in metabolic handling in the intermittent group, not so much in the continuous group.
Ah, okay.
So that's sort of evidence that you've got an improvement through that mode of intermittent fasting. But the more recent thing is, well, can I do that without creating an energy deficit at all? And when you think about it, it is the carbohydrate that really is doing the transitioning into that fed state. So if I can attenuate the carbohydrate or have periods where I'm restricting the carbohydrate, I could achieve the same result. And that's what we showed in the more recent paper that we showed, is that because we know the acute effects of fasting, that actually you get the same acute effects if you just carbohydrate restrict. There is a caveat to that, obviously, because if you're going to keep the calories the same, you're going to have to displace the carbohydrate with something else. And what you invariably displace it with is fat. So it's not to say that all of a sudden you're going to start melting away your body fat, because you'll be burning a lot of the fat that you're consuming, not the fat that's inside of you. And that's the same argument against sort of low carbohydrate diets. Going back to one of your really early questions, that low carbohydrate diets are not going to just miraculously get you to lose weight if you're in energy balance, because you're just you're burning more fat, absolutely, but you'll be burning the fat that you're feeding, not the fat that's inside of you.
Yeah.
So it's basically neutral. And actually, if you look at the Kevin Hall studies, the metabolic ward studies, if anything, it's the low-fat diets that give you more body fat loss than the low-carbohydrate diets.
Really?
When you correct everything for calories.
Ah, okay.
And that's not just his study, as other isocaloric studies have shown the same. So it's not necessarily this metabolic advantage from a weight loss point of view.
Yeah.
But certainly manipulating the carbohydrate is going to have clear metabolic effects. And that's why we're interested in, can we advocate an intermittent carbohydrate restriction rather than an intermittent energy restriction?
Yeah.
Is that going to be a low carb 5-2? This is what we've piloted in our more recent study. But previously, we've also dabbled with a low carb time restricted eating. So you can eat things outside of the window, provided it's not carbohydrate. So yeah, it's like a modern manifestation of no carbs after 5.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a straightforward thing, but it's a regimented way, I suppose, to get people to not overfuel. I think that's the end result. Is the problem we have today is that people are just overfueling all the time.
Yeah.
And that's partly down to society now, because whereas maybe our parents, grandparents, depending on how old you are, where they used to have breakfast, lunch, dinner, and maybe even supper before they went to bed, and now we don't have distinct meals. We're like grazing all the time. We might have an energy load in the evening, but we've got a long eating window, but also we're constantly eating and drinking or consuming calories throughout the day. And that's driven by the fact that almost everywhere we go is giving us this idea that we can't go for more than 2 hours without having something to eat.
Yeah.
We've got to constantly go and have a coffee here or have a cake there or go to that vending machine, or when I'm filling up the car for petrol, or nowadays, obviously even more so because I'm going to have to wait for the car to charge.
Yeah.
I'm going to go and have something to eat.
Yeah.
So, and everything is catered for that.
Yeah.
It's catered for people to eat at every opportunity or drink at every opportunity.
Yeah.
So the likelihood of people overfueling is rife.
And it seems like that's the main driver of what we've been talking about here today.
Exactly, yeah. Because if you're constantly in that fed state all the time, or you're fueling more than you're using, then all that surplus fuel is going to end up accumulating where it should be. Yeah. Now that might lead to weight gain, of course, but it might also lead to metabolic consequences, increased visceral fat, increased cardiovascular risk, pre-diabetes in people that are lean. Yeah. And I mean, we did some work with Hammersmith not too far from here, where looking at MRI across a whole spectrum of people, if you look at lean people that have normal BMI, about 1 in 10 of them have high levels of visceral fat, which you wouldn't normally think about, because they would think, oh, they're normal weight, they're absolutely fine. In fact, they've got normal body fat levels, but they've got high liver fat, high visceral fat, and that's a consequence of poor diet and lifestyle, even though they're normal and lean. Yeah. And that's a worry, because, of course, you're not going to be able to identify those normally. No. Someone who's overweight or obese, that's easy. Yeah. You can spot them. Yeah. Or you can screen for them or triage them. Yeah. Not so much other people.
Would that make you a fan of people doing some of these DEXA scans to assess visceral fat?
Well, I wouldn't do a DEXA scan because it's not really a good measure of visceral fat. It's a bit of a fudge, the way in which they do it. But I suppose it's not so bad in lean people, but when people are large, it's difficult to use DEXA. I wouldn't say you have to go to that nth degree, but I think it might be a catalyst for people to have a look at their own diet and lifestyle and to think, is my current diet and lifestyle conducive to me running a risk of having this issue? So, you can go and measure it to confirm or deny it. But actually, you could probably guess from the way in which you're you're living your life in a way.
Yeah.
And that's not to say you've got to live like a monk.
Yeah.
Or you got to suddenly change to another extreme.
Yeah.
But just being conscious of what you're eating, when you're eating it, in relation to everything else that you're doing.
Yeah.
And you can become more nuanced about things when you start to look at how that interplay between diet and exercise comes into play. So it's not just whether you're doing a certain amount of exercise or following a certain amount of diet, but what you're doing, how you're timing your meals, and what the composition of those meals are around the exercise that you're doing becomes important as well. So it can be, there's lots of facets to it that you can look at. And that means that you can personalize it a bit better to yourself, not because of certain glucose response to a muffin or whatever it is that you're trying to use as a metric, but just having an appreciation, which is what true personalized nutrition is all about. What's your current diet and lifestyle? And what could we do to optimize that?
Yeah.
In terms of a change.
So we've talked about metabolism. I think we've defined the difference and what we mean by metabolic rate, how much of that is actually contributed to by organs that people perhaps don't really think about.
Mm-hmm.
And we've defined metabolic flexibility and inflexibility and ways in which to improve one's flexibility through exercise, energy restriction, but also ways in which you can have energy restriction as a byproduct of the guide, like time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting, and maybe a trigger to sort of look at your own diet and lifestyle and figure out whether there is erroneous visceral fat. Is there anything else that might be a bit of a hack or a strategy outside of the obvious things that could enhance people's metabolic flexibility?
I would say go down to the route of saying it's a hack, but I think it's having that understanding of what impact things are having on you. I think that's an important thing for people to get a handle on.
Okay.
So if you say, let's say, feeding carbohydrate versus feeding fat, or this whole idea that I can't have carbohydrate at all. I think you can't think in black and white terms like that. But if you're constantly having carbohydrate all the time, like every 2 hours, and you're totally sedentary, then obviously that's not going to be an issue. That's going to be an issue for you. But it can be more nuanced than that. So where you time your carbohydrate. So people talk about things like training low. So maybe deliberately not having breakfast before you do some sort of cardio exercise, and then having your carbohydrate afterwards. How you might time your protein around your exercise that you're doing. How you might meal structure things. What meals will you have when, what the composition of those meals, what's the sort of energy content of those meals. There's lots of things that you can do, and you might also even go down to strategies like periodic feeding. So it might be where you're doing periods of fasting, maybe, or it might be periods of where you're deliberately not having carbohydrate, whether that's for a whole day or for a meal, versus other times where you are having carbohydrates. So it's sort of, there's lots of interplay there.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is around a message that everybody has been trying to say for years, which is there's no bad or good, everything in moderation. It's like horses for courses. It's fuel for the work or the lifestyle that you've got. And if you're fueling appropriately, you're not going to have any issues. And that is including not just carbohydrate and fat, but also protein. I know you've obviously got an interest in protein, but protein is now everywhere. Everything has got labeled protein in
extra
it.
protein.
And is that because we don't eat enough protein? Not necessarily to do with that, but We know that protein has a distinct role that we need to be mindful of, and particularly in people that are of an older generation, that protein intake and the timing of that protein becomes important. It's not a sin-free macronutrient necessarily, but it performs a particular function. And particularly if you're looking at maintaining muscle function or muscle mass or building muscle mass, or maybe attenuating the loss of muscle mass with age, then protein is an important thing. It's also something that could be incorporated into other strategies. Like we said, if you're going to periodically restrict carbohydrate or do time-restricted eating, you could have protein outside of that window. And there's certain things that you can have at certain times versus others. So it's, again, just that whole nuanced way of thinking about things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a lot there
that was great. There's a lot there to unpack for a lot of people, but I think we've done a good job of explaining metabolism, metabolic flexibility. I think it's a really interesting subject, and I think a lot more people are going to understand this quite difficult subject to wrap your head around, but it has huge knock-on effect on the diseases of our time. So I appreciate your thoughts on this. If you loved that episode, you will love the full library of podcasts from the Doctor's Kitchen Library. We talk about everything from inflammation, supplements, and food as medicine. Just like this episode right here. You can click it right now and check it out.